Good day. The last 24 hours have been particularly important in terms of the overall conflict in Ukraine and also in relation to Ukraine's ongoing offensive in the Kiev region, but also perhaps even more critically on the other Ukrainian battlefields. It is also an important day in terms of clear signals from the Middle East that we are indeed heading towards an all-out war there, with the United States and its Western allies now straightforwardly aligning themselves against Iran and presumably Iran's backers, China and Russia. But anyway, let's first of all discuss the single most important event that took place yesterday, and that was a meeting that took place in the Kremlin, in the presidential residence of Novo Ogaryovo, which is actually some distance from Moscow itself. It's in the countryside, but it's an important compound in which Putin regularly meets with his officials. There are large conference rooms and facilities there. For the record, for those who are historically interested, it was originally a Soviet-era dacha created for the Soviet politician Georgy Malenkov, who briefly succeeded Stalin as Soviet premier in 1953, until he was in turn displaced by the subsequent Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Anyway, Novo Ogaryovo is an important place. It was revived by Gorbachev in the 1980s as the president's alternative residence in Moscow. And though, as I seem to remember, Yeltsin tended to avoid it, Putin uses it regularly, and it might in some respects be an even more important venue for top-level meetings than the Kremlin itself is. Anyway, what happened over the course of this meeting that makes this meeting so important? Firstly, of course, the meeting was convened specifically to discuss the situation in the conflict area in Kursk. It was specifically about the situation in Kursk, though it's also important to say that the meeting also looked at the general situation in the zone of the special military operation in Ukraine. Now, I think it is important to make a distinction between the conflict in Kursk and the conflict that is ongoing on former Ukrainian territory, or the Russians would say former Ukrainian territory, in the zone of what the Russians call the special military operation. As I understand it, the territory where the fighting that continues to take place in Ukraine, in all the places that we are familiar with, Volchansk, Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, all of those places, that remains a special military operation so designated by Putin in his original decree authorizing the Russian military to intervene in Ukraine. That, as I said, was authorized in February 2022. What was announced 2 days ago, covering the situation not just in Kursk, but also in the other border regions, western border regions of Russia, Belgorod and Bryansk regions, is an anti-terrorist regime. The Russian authorities have designated the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk as a terrorist operation, and it is on that basis that they are dealing with it. And that has resulted in a number of decisions that the Russian authorities have taken. And leading from that, we have had some important words from Putin itself. Now, it is important to say that the conflict in Ukraine, which remains a special military operation, is a conflict, obviously, between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The conflict in Kursk and Bryansk and Belgorod regions is also a conflict between the Ukrainians and the Russians. The Russian authorities consider that conflict to be the one on Russian territory, a terrorist operation. Both conflicts are conducted, in other words, by both parties, and this means that so far as the Russians are concerned, the government in Kiev, the authorities in Kiev, have committed a terrorist act. Now, I appreciate that may not be one view that will be shared by some people or many people in the West, but that is what the Russians conceptually, how the Russians conceptually see events that have taken place, are taking place inside Russia. And the makeup of the meeting, the nature of the people who attended the meeting, which was a very extended meeting, it included a large number of people, tells us as much. So I'm going to read out who attended this meeting, which took place yesterday in Moscow. So Putin chaired it. It happened in Novo-Ogaryovo. Shoigu, who is, of course, the Secretary of the Security Council, was there. So was Marat Khushnulin, who is the Deputy Prime Minister in charge of the construction industry. His job is to, amongst his tasks, are to create fortifications and such things, but also he helps with refurbishment and restoration of damaged and destroyed buildings. Presidential aide Alexei Dyumin, an extremely fast rising official, until recently governor of Tula region, which is lies at the heart of Russia's military industrial complex. He has a background in special forces and also in anti-terrorist work, and he is seen by many people as a potential successor to Putin. The Interior Minister, Vladimir Kolokoltsev, who's in charge of the police, the Civil Defense Minister and Emergencies Minister, Alexander Kurenkov, the FSB Director, who's also got in charge of anti-terrorism, who is Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the Rosgvardia organization, which has an anti-terrorist, internal security dimension, who is Viktor Zolotov, and the deputy and the chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov. And others who also attended include Denis Manturov, who is the deputy prime minister in overall charge of the economy, the defense minister Andrei Belousov, the governor of Belgorod region, Gladkov, the governor of Bryansk region, Bogomaz, and the acting governor of Kursk region, Alexei Smirnov. So this is a big meeting. It brings people, the entire leadership, if you like, of the security services, the FSB, the Rosgvardia organization, the military, they're all there. And, of course, people like Dyumin are also there, and also people from the economic bloc of the government, they're there too. So there was this very top-level, top-heavy meeting in Moscow. And it's undoubtedly the case that the meeting went on for several hours. And I am going to say straight away that the lead speaker over the course of this meeting almost certainly was Gerasimov. Putin, over the course of the publicly released discussions, refers to the fact that a full briefing from the military is going to be provided. But of course, we have not been provided with the text of that meeting because, of course, it contains military secrets, classified information. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about a meeting that took place on Tuesday, in which Gerasimov participated by video link. I think it was on Tuesday, in which Gerasimov delivered a brief report to Putin. I read it out in the video that I did on the following day. A lot of people have focused on that, on what Gerasimov said at that meeting and at Putin's facial expressions, which I think have been massively overanalyzed myself. And there's been a lot of comments about the fact that Gerasimov wasn't providing Putin with the full information. I have to say that I find myself incredulous that people should make observations of that kind, because, of course, the briefing that Gerasimov gave by video link, short as it was not the main briefing that Gerasimov would have given at that meeting. The main briefing which Gerasimov, as Chief of General Staff, would have provided would have been in the part of the meeting that was not publicised. Obviously, the Kremlin would not issue the full television address of what Gerasimov had to say, disclosing all kinds of military secrets and plans that the Russians might have. The part of Gerasimov's report that we were given was specifically written and drawn up and intended for public consumption, and would have been agreed with Gerasimov, with the General Staff, by the officials, the officials working for Putin himself. So I think this is a point that I feel I have to clarify, because, again, I don't understand how people don't see it, but there it is. Anyway, the main part of this meeting yesterday would have discussed the military situation and the various steps that the authorities, the Russian authorities, are going to take in relation to what they now consider an anti-terrorist operation that they're conducting in Kursk region, and also in Bryansk and in Belgorod region. But over the course of his public comments, which were televised and broadcast to the Russian nation, and of which the Kremlin has provided us with a readout, Putin said some very important things, and they relate to the situation with possible negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. He said this: before we move forward and hear from the meeting participants, I would like to make a few remarks. It is now becoming increasingly clear why the Kiev regime rejected our proposals for a peaceful settlement, as well as those from interested and neutral mediators. It appears that the enemy, notice he now says specifically the enemy. It appears that the enemy, with the support from their Western backers, is executing their directives, and the West is using Ukrainians as proxies in this conflict. It seems the opponent is aiming to strengthen their negotiating position for the future. However, what kind of negotiations can we have with those who indiscriminately attack civilians and civilian infrastructure, or pose threats to nuclear power facilities? Now note those last words, pose threats to nuclear power facilities. He doesn't mention here the Kursk nuclear power plant, and these words were made shortly after the drone attack, what the Russians say was a drone attack by the Ukrainians on the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. Zelensky, the Ukrainians, claim that it was a fire caused by the Russians setting fire to various tires located presumably on the top of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I don't believe that explanation. I'm sure that this is that what the Russians have been saying about this is true. So anyway, Putin specifically refers to threats to nuclear power facilities, and he says this in plural. He uses the plural here. Now, it could be that he's referring to the attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, or, of course, he could be referring also to the Kursk nuclear power plant. He's clearly leaving this ambiguous. I think it is intended to refer to both. And then he goes on to say, what is there to discuss with such parties? So he is in effect ruling out negotiations. I think that one can cut and splice these words as one chooses, but they've clearly been carefully prepared. He says that he would like to make a few remarks. He says that attempts have been made by the Russians to find a peaceful way out of this conflict. He says that interested and neutral mediators have also done what they can. But what we see, in effect, is that the Ukrainian leadership, Zelensky and his government, are pursuing what the Russians construe to be terrorist acts. These encompass attacks against nuclear power facilities. What is there to discuss with such parties? He is in effect ruling out negotiations. And this is as far as the Russians have gone on this. Up to now, they have consistently said that they are prepared to negotiate. This is not a complete, final slamming of the door, but I think that it clearly indicates that from now on, the Russians are going to act on the assumption that there is never going to be a negotiation, and that if proposals for a negotiation do start to emerge, the Russians will effectively refuse to negotiate up to and until President Zelensky, and not just President Zelensky, but his entire team, exit the scene. That, it seems to me, is clear. And I think we have now reached that point where the Russians are going to be telling all the various mediators, the Indian government, the Chinese government, all of those governments, that look, we've all done our best. We've tried as hard as we can. Look at what these people do. Look at what these people get up to. How reckless and irresponsible they have become. Surely you can see that they do pose an existential threat to our country, that they are not, as the Russians would say, agreement capable. The West controls them anyway. There is no point, therefore, in wasting too much time trying to find negotiations. Whilst they are there in Kiev, negotiations cannot take place. That is what I construe Putin as having said. Anyway, he then goes on to discuss other things, and he talks about some of the intentions that the Ukrainians have. And I will read what he says because it is interesting. These actions clearly aim to achieve a primary military objective, to halt the advance of our forces in their effort to fully liberate the territories of the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republic, the Novorossiya region. So what is the current situation on the front lines and what are the results? The pace of offensive operations by the Russian armed forces, volunteers and veterans has not only remained steady but has actually increased by 50%. Our troops are advancing along the entire front. So he's saying we are not going to transfer any troops from the front lines. We're going to continue with our military operation. We're going to push forward and continue our advance. That's what I've been saying that the Russians would do. And by the way, shortly before I started making this program, an article appeared in the New York Times which confirms the same thing. The New York Times has been in touch with Ukrainian soldiers in some of the battle zones, including Chasiv Yar. There have been reports or claims by various people that the Russians have transferred troops from Chasiv Yar to Kursk region. The Ukrainian soldiers on the ground say that they have seen absolutely no sign of this at all. The pressure from the Russians remains the same. It continues relentlessly. And as we will see, the Russian advance continues and continues unabated. And Putin does not need to transfer forces from the front lines because, as we will see, he not only has forces in reserve that he can bring to bear against the forces that the Ukrainians have sent into Kursk, but in a sense, and I am being very careful in what I say here, he's got the Ukrainians where he wants them. A point which I think some people in the West do understand, but which, of course, a lot of others, for the moment at least, are resisting. And then Putin goes on to say, another clear objective of the enemy is to create discord and division within our society, to instill fear and undermine the unity and cohesion of the Russian people. They aim to disrupt the domestic political landscape. However, the response from Russian citizens has been resolute. There is widespread support for those in need, strong backing for the army, and importantly, a rising number of individuals eager to join the ranks of those heroically defending Russia. Recently, there has been a notable increase in the number of people signing contracts with the Ministry of Defense. That is what Putin says. I cannot confirm this, but I think it is likely to be true. When a few months ago, the Ukrainians carried out incursions, much smaller incursions, into Belgorod region, there was a significant uptick, apparently, of men, young men, perhaps older men too, volunteering to join the Russian army to defend Russia from foreign invasion. So it is entirely plausible that what Putin is saying is true. As I said, I can't corroborate it. I'm not saying that there hasn't been some dismay and worry on the part of some people in Russia. But again, overall, I think that this is something, by the way, which Westerners find difficult to understand. The ability of Russian society to absorb these sort of shocks is of an entirely different level from what one would expect were they to happen in the West. I experienced this myself around 20 years ago. I was in Moscow at a time when various terrorist events took place, including the seizure of the school in Beslan by Islamist fighters in the northern Caucasus. I was astonished at the extent to which Russians just carried on and were prepared to continue living their lives, but also supporting what the authorities would do. The lack of any sense of panic or worry at the time of those events. And it might have been in conjunction with this or perhaps some other time. I was also in Moscow at a time when there had been reports of bomb attacks on the Moscow metro. Again, I don't have very clear memory of those incidents. But again, I remember being struck at the time by the ability of Russian society to absorb that. Russia is a country which has lived through wars. Second World War was obviously perhaps the biggest war in human history, at least over the 4-year period that it was fought out. There was also, of course, the fighting in the northern Caucasus. This is a society which has a degree of understanding of war and an understanding of how to deal with the pressures of war, which societies in the West, particularly, I have to say, in the English-speaking West, struggle to understand. So, yes, perhaps Putin is overstating things, but if he is basically telling the truth here, I would not be surprised. In fact, I strongly suspect that he is. And then he says that the leaders of the Kiev regime are not only perpetrating crimes against Russian people, but are also, in effect, pursuing the destruction of their own citizens, the Ukrainian people, whom they evidently no longer view as their own. The casualties among the Ukrainian armed forces are rising sharply, including among their most effective units and divisions, which are being redeployed to our borders. The adversary will undoubtedly face a strong response, and all the objectives we have set will be achieved. Now, about the rising losses, well, we've had some information about that from the Defence Ministry, which I will come to shortly. But the point, again, about those last comments is that what Putin is now saying is that the government in Kiev, what he refers to as the Kiev regime, is not only a threat to the people of Russia, it is also a threat to the people of Ukraine itself, because it is sacrificing their lives in ever larger numbers uselessly. And again, it's not quite a call for the overthrow of the government in Kiev, but it comes very close. And in conjunction with his earlier comments, I have to say that I think that threshold, that line has now probably been passed. So I said previously in the various programs that I've done since the Kursk incursion began, that if the Ukrainians believe that the incursion has strengthened their hand in negotiations, they're not only wrong, what they have almost certainly done is that they have destroyed the prospects of negotiations at any rate, at any time soon, almost certainly altogether. And I think that when the Russians explain all of this to the various countries that have been urging them to negotiate, to the Chinese, to the Indians, to all of the others, they will meet a receptive response. I discussed, again, 1 or 2 or 3 videos ago, how an article on Global Times, Chinese newspaper, government newspaper, which covered the Kursk incursion, suggested absolute fury in Beijing with what had just happened. While they blamed the Americans for it, they were clearly very angry with the Ukrainians. I got the sense that they feel that the Ukrainians, their foreign minister came along to China, met with the Chinese foreign minister Wang Yi in Guangdong, gave assurances that Ukraine is indeed interested in negotiations, only the Ukrainians have now taken a step which the Chinese clearly see as intended, or in effect making negotiations impossible. So from a Chinese point of view, this has done massive damage to their trust in Kiev, and I suspect this is true of all the various other mediators as well, that they've been trying to get the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, and they see that instead the Ukrainians have pulled off this particular trick. So there we are. It seems to me that Putin is taking the very hardest possible line that one might expect. He is now moving publicly towards a position that there can be no talks whilst the current government remains in place in Kiev, and that the current government in Kiev must be removed. Now, perhaps not coincidentally, again, just before I started making this program, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, has now made another public comment that the Americans have now decided on the person that they intend to replace Zelensky with, and it is Arsen Avakov, who was the interior minister for many years after the Maidan events. I have no idea whether this is true. It might be simply something that the Russians are saying in order to create more trouble in Kiev, quite possibly. Avakov and Zelensky do not get on. Zelensky engineered, as I remember, Avakov's dismissal, or at least I think it was Zelensky. But anyway, Avakov, as I said, was forced out of his position in the Interior Ministry. Avakov is widely believed, in Russia at least, to have very, very close connections with the various hardline nationalists. I'm being euphemistic about what they are in Ukraine. He's believed to have sponsored and organized many of the original Ukrainian militias. He's seen in Russia as responsible for many of the original violent events that took place in 2014. He would certainly not be somebody, I think, that the Russians would be willing to negotiate with if he ever were to replace Zelensky, just saying. But, it might be that the Russians have information in Kiev which might, bear all of this out. But certainly, if Avakov replaces Zelensky, I don't think that would be the sort of change in regime in Kiev that would satisfy the Russians. I certainly don't imagine that that their resolve to see this thing through would end simply because an even more hardline figure had taken the place of Zelensky. Just saying. But anyway, this is where we are. Now, there were various contributions from many of the participants of the meeting. One of the people who spoke at some length was the acting governor of Kursk region, Alexei Smirnov. I think some of his words actually have been somewhat misconstrued. Anyway, he is reported by the Kremlin to have said the following. The situation in the regions is quite challenging right now. Currently, the enemy controls 28 communities. Now, this is not villages. 28 communities might mean hamlets, very small isolated places. He then went on to say they've penetrated 12 kilometers deep into the territory of the Kursk region with a 40-kilometer wide front line. And then Putin interrupted him and said, Mr. Smirnov, the military will update us on the specifics of the front line, width and depth. What we need from you is an update on the socio-economic situation and a report on the assistance provided to the people. So that basically makes the point that I made earlier, that Gerasimov's main report, which would have been the single longest and most detailed report provided over the course of this meeting, would have come later. And of course, it's not one of the reports of which the Kremlin has provided us with the transcript for obvious reasons. Now, 28 communities, as I said, lots of people have seized on this, 28 villages, but then Smirnov went on to clarify, we have 28 communities in this zone, home to approximately 2,000 people whose whereabouts remain unknown. Now, this is a somewhat ambiguous statement. I mean, it's not intended to be ambiguous, but it's not clear to me whether what Smirnov means is that these communities were inhabited by 2,000 people, in which case some of them must be very small indeed, or that there are 2,000 people who used to live in these 28 communities that the Ukrainians currently control, but that they are currently unaccounted for by the Russian authorities. They might still be in the areas which the Ukrainians control or something like that. So, as I said, I'm not quite sure what Smirnov means there. But anyway, that's what he said. He also says that the area, the territory that the Ukrainians control or have penetrated is, he doesn't say control, he says penetrated, is 12 kilometers deep and that there is a 40-kilometer wide front line. So that means that the main area where the fighting is taking place, where the Ukrainians are present, is an area of around 480 kilometers square by my probably very imperfect maths. General Syrsky, the overall military commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, says that the area that the Ukrainians control consists of, it amounts to 1,000 square kilometers, more than double what Smirnov says. Syrsky is not always a very reliable reporter of events. I remember that back about a year ago, during the Ukrainian counterattacks around Bakhmut, he at one point claimed that the Ukrainians had Bakhmut surrounded. And on another occasion, I seem to remember that he said that the Ukrainians have established fire control over Bakhmut. Neither of these claims was true. Indeed, I was following the fighting at the time very closely, and they were absurdly wrong. So it may be that what Syrsky says on this occasion is not true either. On balance, I have to say, I'm much more willing to believe what Smirnov himself tells us. We're talking about a territory of around 480 square kilometers. And I'm going to say straight away that this may sound like a lot of territory, but we're talking about an area of dense forest and small villages. Even Suja itself, the place that has been bitterly fought over, the only place in this area which could be called a town is a small place of between 5,000 and 6,500 people. This is a collection of small villages on the border where the fighting, as I said, is currently happening. Over the course of yesterday, the Ukrainians, as we shall see in a moment, banged along various places along the front lines, along the border as well, tried to break in to places in Belgorod region. For the moment, their various attempts have been unsuccessful. The fighting appears to be confined to a relatively contained area of Kursk region. Now, this is the point where I'm going to eventually, in a moment, transfer to a discussion of the actual military situation as I understand it. But before I do, it's important again to reiterate that this is a counter-terrorist operation so far as the Russians are concerned. It seems that forces from many different agencies are being deployed to the area. Police, military, obviously, people from the Rostgvardia organization, people also from the FSB. And it is being conducted with many different agencies involved, though obviously the military are playing the biggest role. And one individual has apparently, as a result of this meeting, been appointed to supervise the whole situation along the border, and that is Alexei Dyumin, the presidential aide, the former governor of Tula region, the person who has had significant responsibility before for the efficient work of the military-industrial complex, the man who's had responsibility for special forces. He was was involved in special forces. He's supposed to have been the special forces officer who supervised the Crimea operation in 2014, and somebody who's also had contact with the FSB, and someone who, to reiterate again, is the rising star in the Russian political firmament, arguably Putin's, or most plausibly perhaps, the man most plausibly considered to be Putin's eventual successor. So an important person has been sent to take overall charge of the situation. Now, Dyumin is not a general. He's never worked within the general staff. He's never fulfilled that kind of command role. The Russian military officer who is in overall charge of operations in Kursk region was identified over the course of this meeting by Smirnov, the acting governor, as Colonel General Nikiforov. And I'm assuming that, well, he is clearly the general officer who is now running things in Kursk region on behalf of the Russians. Now, this is where I come back to the private emails I've been getting from the source, who I have been discussing in various recent programs, because yesterday he sent me what is perhaps the most interesting message of all. And I have to be especially careful what I disclose about it, because I don't, as I said, want to give away information about him that might make it possible for people to work out who he is. But what he said over the course of this email was very interesting indeed, and gave a particular dimension to the events which are currently playing out in Kursk region. Now, to repeat again, this person has very strong sources inside Russia. And he has previously and consistently provided me with very reliable information about the kind of things that are going on inside Russia and about the discussions that are taking place there. So he is very well informed about the situation. He's also very, very well informed indeed about the operations of various military units, and my sense is that he must have contacts with some of the people who work in these units, but I don't want to say more about that. This person also said to me 2 months ago that the Russians had worked out that the Ukrainians were intending to carry out an operation in Kursk region, the objective of which was to capture Kurchatov, the nuclear power plant, and ultimately maybe the nuclear weapons storage facility where tactical nuclear warheads for the Iskander-M systems are located. So this is what this person has been saying. Anyway, based on sources which he has, and I should say that he has provided me with information about these sources, and whenever he's provided me with information about his sources, well, that information has turned out to correspond very closely with things that I've been able to verify as true. Again, I'm being complicated in what I say. Anyway, based on information provided by his sources, he informs me that the Russians started to prepare for the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk around 2 weeks before it happened. He has identified the forces involved, some of which are confirmed as present in the Kursk region from the various reports, the many reports that have been coming from the battle fronts. And he has explained, or he has described, the tactics that had been developed, which was not to fight the Ukrainians in head-on battles, but rather to use the landscape, the forests in this area, to conduct ambushes of the Ukrainian columns as they trundled along the roads towards their various objectives. And the objective was principally to take out the heavy armour, to destroy the armour, the armoured vehicles, the tanks, the Bradleys, the Strikers, the Marders, all of those machines, with teams of light infantry being deployed to deal with the Ukrainian infantry that were then left caught in the open. And all of this was prepared very carefully in advance. He's provided me with details of the tactics. I'm not going to discuss any of that. And he said that this is exactly what has been happening. He says that the situation that the Ukrainians entered into, what was in effect a hornet's nest, that they've been taking terrible losses as a result. We'll discuss all of this shortly, and that they're facing, in a kind of a sense, I won't say a partisan war, because that would certainly be an overstatement, but a war of ambushes and attacks, which has been disorganizing them and which has been forcing them to do something which they had not initially planned to do. The original plan, and there's been discussions about this now in the ordinary Russian media, Redovka has discussed this at length in various articles. The original plan was to see Suja drive up the road to Kursk and capture the Kurchatov and the nuclear power plant there within 1 or 2 days. That didn't happen because everything was dislocated, and in order to try to keep moving, or to try to protect Ukrainian troops who find themselves the subject of these ambushes, the Ukrainians have been obliged to fan out across the countryside, thinning their forces by occupying what are in effect deserted and undefended villages. Now, this is a very interesting explanation of the battle, of what's going on, but is it true? Well, I have to say it does correspond with a lot of the information I've been getting from the battlefronts. And there was an interesting piece of information on the Defense Ministry's Telegram channel, which the Russian Defense Ministry's Telegram channel, which appeared to confirm it. It spoke about how the Russians are using their tanks in Kursk region. It spoke of Russian tanks being concealed in forested areas and also carrying out ambush tactics against Ukrainian forces as they try to move along the roads which the Russians anticipated they would be moving along. In other words, the Russian ambush parties, the special forces, if I could call them that, and the tanks have been concealed along the roads in order to knock out the Ukrainians in that way. And this same source has told me that there is a very considerable concentration of drone operators based in Kursk itself. They were pre-positioned there well before the fighting, and they have been unleashed. And in fact, one of the things that we have been seeing, in fact, there's ample video of this, is large numbers of Ukrainian armoured vehicles being destroyed by Lancet drones. These are not FPV drones, these are much bigger suicide drones operated to deadly effect by the Russians, and they're being heavily used in this area, in the Kursk area. And again, this source told me how that was happening, and it can be corroborated again from what we see. Now, the point about the tanks being used to conduct ambushes, that entry that appeared on the Russian Defense Ministry's website, that was posted some hours after I received this email from this source. Now, as I said, I want to stress, I'm getting all this information from one source. There does seem to be some external corroboration of it. I have expressed skepticism about the idea that the Russians actually planned a trap for the Ukrainians in Kursk region. In the past, I've given the reasons why. I have said that I found it difficult to believe that Putin would deliberately put the lives of civilians at risk by allowing such a thing to happen, that the Russian Defense Ministry, that the officials within the Russian military might be worried also about opening themselves up to the risk of exposing or appearing to expose Kursk and the nuclear power plant to an operation, to seizure, to the kind of operation that the Ukrainians were trying to launch. But I have to say this also, there comes a point when the evidence starts to stack up, and even a skeptic like myself has to start reconsidering his own skepticism and must start asking and telling himself, well, look, if you're told this, if you were warned about this 2 months ago, if you saw this, if this person has provided you with information which is consistent repeatedly with things that are developing, are taking place, well, can you continue? Are you justified in continuing with your skepticism? Well, I'm going to leave it to you to take your view. But let me just say again, what this source has provided me with is fully consistent with everything that has happened and everything that is happening now. I accept that it is diametrically different from what we're hearing from multiple other reports, from reports that are being published by the West, in the West, from reports that are coming from the Ukrainians themselves, from reports that are coming also, it must be said, from some Russian Telegram channels and sites, Ribar, Podolyaka, people of that kind. As I said, ultimately, as I said, you have to make a decision who exactly you believe and whether your skepticism is justified. I am close now to reaching that point where I'm coming round to the view that continuing to exercise skepticism is unwarranted. I'm just going to say that. But as I said, I throw it out there. You can decide for yourself. Anyway, let's move on and actually discuss what happened on the battlefields in Kursk over the last 24 hours. Now, before I do, here perhaps it's important to make one quick further observation, which is that, of course, Siersky has said that the Ukrainians control 1,000 square kilometers of territory. Smirnov has said that the area where the fighting is taking place covers 480 square kilometers. But of course, it's obvious that the Ukrainians do not control every square meter of this territory. They are not fully consolidated in control of this territory. There are Russians operating right across this territory, and of course there are Ukrainians. This is a large territory. There is, as it's heavily forested in places. We're talking about a place which is not very built up. It's nothing like Donbass. It's small villages, often at a substantial distance from each other. It's not territory the Ukrainians securely control. The point has been made by, oh goodness, I've forgotten his name, person on, one of the best commentators on these things. I can't remember his name. It'll come back to me. Anyway, this person has made the point on his YouTube channel. I will say who he was in my next program. Anyway, this person has made the point that it is in some ways similar to the situation which existed during Russia's advance on Kiev in 2022. The maps show huge areas of northern Ukraine supposedly under Russian control. In fact, Russian forces in the area probably numbered no more than 40,000. The Russians had no control over most of this territory. The Ukrainians continue to operate and have troops and forces right across it. And the same thing is playing out in this area in Kursk. In fact, this commentator has suggested that the Ukrainian force that is involved in this operation perhaps numbers somewhere in the region of 15,000 men, of whom 4,000 will be infantry, and that is nowhere near enough to establish secure control, particularly over a territory like this. And I think that is probably right. But anyway, let's now go to the military situation, and we can go now to what the Russian Defense Ministry is saying. And this is their latest update on the military situation in Kursk region. Notice that because this is, as I said, an anti-terrorist operation, if you like, separate from the special military operation, the Russians, the Defense Ministry, always gives separate updates about it. These updates are not included within the main update provided about what is going on within the special military operation. Anyway, this is what the Defense Ministry tells us. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to repel Ukrainian attempts to invade the territory of the Russian Federation. Over the past 24 hours, active actions by Group of Forces North and Allied reserves, army aviation, and unmanned aerial vehicles and artillery fire prevented enemy mobile armoured groups from forging deep into Russian territory close to Obshy Kolodez, Snagist, Kauchuk and Alexeyevsky. Now, I'm going to say the only two places that I've been able to find on the map amongst these are Snagist and Kauchuk. Snagist is near to Korenovo, bitterly fought village, securely under Russian control, from what I understand. The Russians recaptured Snagist about a day or so ago. The Ukrainians, according to this report, sent shall we call it, a sabotage and reconnaissance group in that direction, but it was defeated. Kauchuk lies northwards towards Kromsky Kolodez, and it's south of Kromsky Kolodez. Again, it seems a small Ukrainian force was sent northwards in that direction, trying to penetrate through, but the Russians stopped it and appear to have destroyed it in this village of Kauchuk. Now, it's probable that the Ukrainians in this last column were heading northwards towards the village of Lvov, which is located not that far from Kurchatov. And that was the purpose of this operation. The Ukrainians published what I understand is widely seen as a fake of a Ukrainian soldier standing before a sign which shows Lvov. I'm guessing that the original Ukrainian plan was to push upward and to reach Lvov, but this apparently failed, and the grouping appears to have been destroyed even as it was heading in this direction. It is important to stress that to the extent that we can talk about the front line, this is not where the front line is. We are talking about reconnaissance groups trying to penetrate deep into Russian-controlled territory, getting closer to Kurchatov, failing to do so everywhere else. So it looks to me the front line is starting to stabilize, or might even have been pushed back in places. Anyway, the report then goes on to say, an attack launched by the 82nd Airborne Assault Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine in the direction of Martinovka has been repelled. There have been various claims about Martinovka having been recaptured by the Ukrainians, that there's lots of battles taking place for control of Martinovka. This report from the Russian Defense Ministry strongly implies that the Russians are in full control of Martinovka, that the Ukrainians have tried to recapture it, but have failed. Anyway, that's what the report from the Russian Defense Ministry says. The report then goes on to say up to 15 Ukrainian personnel, 2 armoured fighting vehicles and 2 motor vehicles were neutralised. In other words, presumably killed. And then the report goes on to say aviation and artillery strikes hit manpower and hardware of 22nd, 61st and 115th Mechanized Brigades and the 80th Airborne Assault Brigade close to Mikhailovka, Korenovo, Nikhailovo, Darino, Olyeshny, Suja and Nikolaevka. These are all places which, so far as I can judge, fall within the same territory that we have been talking about and discussing for some time. Korenovo and Suja, of course, well-known places. Darino as well. I can't pretend as Mikhailovka. I can't pretend that I'm familiar with all of them. But anyway, it looks as if, for the moment, from what I can tell, the major Ukrainian concentration of forces is around Suja itself, and this is where the Russians are shelling and attacking them. And the Russians go on to say up to 15 Ukrainian soldiers and 4 Striker armoured personnel carriers were neutralised, 6 servicemen have been taken prisoners. Aviation and missile troops inflicted fire damage on Ukrainian reserves close to Miropolye, Mogritsa and Petrushevka in Sumy region. During the day, the Ukrainian losses amounted to up to 420 Ukrainian troops, 55 armoured vehicles, including 3 tanks, 8 armoured personnel carriers, 1 infantry fighting vehicle, 43 armoured fighting vehicles, 31 motor vehicles, 1 multiple launch rocket system launcher, and 1 artillery gun. 420 Ukrainian troops is, I think, the highest number of Ukrainian troops killed or wounded, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, over the course of one day, during the course of this operation. Putin said at the meeting in Novo-Ogaryovo that Ukrainian losses are rising, and, well, the Defense Ministry has provided us with information which appears to corroborate that. Now, of course, we have to be careful. It may be that the Defense Ministry has inflated the number of Ukrainian losses. Perhaps they're doing so in order to conform with what Putin is saying. Possible. It's likely also that the great majority of Ukrainian troops who are being killed or wounded, according to the Russians, are not being killed in the various encounter battles that are going on in Kursk region itself, where the numbers who are being killed is relatively small. So if we talk about the fighting, for example, in the area, the aviation and artillery strikes close to Suja, the Russians say that 15 Ukrainian soldiers were killed and 6 were taken prisoner, and they say that so not so many, and 15 Ukrainian soldiers were neutralized in the attack on Martinovka. But it's likely that the 420 are accounted for by deaths and woundings in the area where the Ukrainians have been trying to launch sabotage groups, the clearing up of the sabotage groups. And it's also possible that many of them have been killed and wounded in the missile and bomb strikes that the Russians are conducting in Sumy region, where the Ukrainians have their reserves. Anyway, the Russians say that since the beginning of hostilities in Kursk region, the enemy lost up to 2,030 troops, 35 tanks, 31 armoured personnel carriers, 18 infantry fighting vehicles, 179 armoured fighting vehicles, 78 motor vehicles, 4 anti-aircraft missile systems, one of which is a Patriot, and to that, by the way, must be added a Tunguska point defense system, tracked point defense system, developed by the Soviet Union, still operated by Ukraine. It was the predecessor to the Pantsir. The Ukrainians do not have many of these. That's apparently a potent system. Anyway, one has been seen operating in the Kursk region. There's been pictures of it, and the Russians appear to have tracked it down and appear to have destroyed it today. So this is a rare system, irreplaceable, and it's just been destroyed. and 2 multiple launch rocket systems and 14 field artillery guns. The operation to neutralize the Ukrainian units is in progress. So that's what the Russian Defense Ministry is telling us for 2,030 troops. Now, if killed or wounded, if what this person, whose name I can't remember, says that 15,000 Scott have calibrated. If what Scott have calibrated says is true, and the Ukrainian force numbers around 15,000 men, then it has already lost 2,030. This level of loss is unsustainable, and before long, the entire operation will start to crumble. It cannot be sustained at this level. The source who has been emailing me tells me that, by contrast, Russian losses, because of the tactics the Russians have been using, have been extremely light. A number of troops, conscript soldiers, were taken prisoner by the Ukrainians on the first day in Sudzha, but overall Russian losses are very low. And again, he has highlighted the fact, the source has highlighted the fact that there's been this very heavy loss of armour. 35 tanks, 31 armoured personnel carriers, 18 infantry fighting vehicles, the latter probably Bradleys, 179 armoured fighting vehicles, all at 78 motor vehicles. Equipment Ukraine cannot afford to lose, and which is in very short supply. Anyway, I'm going to say that there's been a tailing off in the number of tanks that the Russians are claiming that they're destroying on this territory. I suspect the reason for that is that the grouping, the Ukrainian grouping, is now running out of its tanks. Just saying. Anyway, that's what the Russian Ministry of Defense tells us. What are we hearing from other sources? Well, I'm going to suggest actually very little. Yesterday, the Ukrainians published some pictures which show one Ukrainian soldier walking down the main street in the center of Sudzha, and an armoured vehicle also operating inside Sudzha. And on the basis of that, there were claims that the Ukrainians control central Sudzha, and it's quite plausible that they do. It may be that the Russians sent their forces into Sudzha. The Akhmat forces, the Chechen forces, were certainly present in Sudzha on the previous day. I thought then that they might have been trying to push the Ukrainians out of Sudzha, but it could be that the Russians briefly reoccupied the areas of central Sudzha in order to carry out, to complete an evacuation of the civilians there, and having done that, that they then pulled back. It's not impossible. It is fully consistent with what the Russians have been doing in this area up to now. Russian reserves continue to arrive. There was a film of a Russian journalist in Kursk region, and you could see a bridge, a railway bridge in the background, and you could see a train full of armoured vehicles, tanks and all that, trundling into Kursk, and it's clear that forces are being steadily built up in this area in order to conduct this counterattack. Going back to that meeting in Moscow that I've been discussing at the start of this program, there was a lot of discussion about the fortified positions that the Russians are creating, and it's clear that the places where those fortifications are being created were not identified, but I'm fairly confident that the references there are to Kurchatov and to the area around it, and of course we have satellite photos of this. So the Russians are securing that area, increasing their forces, conducting their ambushes, all of that kind of thing. As for the Ukrainians, well, maybe they have occupied Sudzha, though I would say that there was these pictures that they published yesterday seem to be very staged. I would have thought that if the Ukrainians were, as of yesterday, in full control of Suja, they would have carried out a more full ceremony, raised a flag, done something like that. It might be that the soldier was walking down the street, knowing that there aren't many Russians around, and that he wouldn't necessarily be a target. I'm not sure that how conclusive these pictures are. And by the way, I saw a report from Reuters earlier today, British news agency, that appeared to think the same thing. But, maybe the Ukrainians have occupied more of Suja. It just remains to be seen. The Ukrainians, as we have seen from the Russian Defense Ministry report, have made various more attempts to send forces northward, but they don't seem to have made any particular progress. The Russians say that the Ukrainian attacks towards Martinovka have been unsuccessful. There are claims, and not just claims, but there's been photographic evidence of a Ukrainian advance to the east of Suja, occupying some small villages, as I said, located to the east of Suja. There's been a lot of claims about this. Again, a push towards Belaya, which the Russians evacuated some days ago. My own view, and it's the view that has also been expressed by the Russian media, is that the Ukrainians are again advancing into these villages, which take them further away from what ought logically to be the main axis of advance. Not so much because they want to conquer this territory or occupy it, but because they want to cause the Russians to redeploy some of the forces that the Russians have now located around Kurchatov to cover the approaches to Kurchatov and to defend the nuclear power station. I think that might be correct, that the Ukrainian objective continues to be Kurchatov, to the extent that the Ukrainians still have an objective in this operation. So the Russians, if they're assuming that this operation, this advance to the west, really is taking place, and that we're not just seeing another reconnaissance group moving westwards to no special purpose, the Russians seem to be unfazed by this. And the main build-up, which is happening in Kursk itself, is continuing. Now, bear in mind that the other day, yesterday, I think, in one of the media interviews that Ukrainian officials gave to the Western media, one of them admitted that there was only so much distance that the Ukrainians could advance, beyond which it would be impossible for them to maintain their supply lines. So even if the Ukrainians are scuttling around empty villages for the moment, even if they were to meet no resistance, the point would come when they would have to stop. But in the meantime, in reality, the Russians are hitting back. They've seemed to have blocked the main advances towards Kurchatov, and along the road from Suja to Kurchatov and to Kursk. The Russian build-up in Kursk itself continues. Quite plausibly, the Russians are advancing in a number of places also. In fact, there's reasons to think that. And anyway, to my mind, it's quite clear that Ukrainian losses are building up and achieving very little. Now, interestingly, there have been the first articles in the West, or at least the first comments in the West, which clearly distance Western governments from this. One appeared in the Wall Street Journal, repeating again that the United States was not informed in advance about this operation, and that they're having serious doubts about this, that the front lines in Donbass are being overstretched and are being denuded of troops, and that this operation might not actually achieve very much. There was another big article to this effect in Der Spiegel, in the German media, and the German government spokesman has also said that the Ukrainians did not inform Germany that this operation would be conducted. And the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Umerov, has apparently been urgently calling Western capitals, trying to get Western capitals to agree to authorize missile strikes against Russian concentrations close to the forces in Kursk. So far, it appears that Western governments are refusing. It may be premature to say that the West is distancing itself from this operation, but one can certainly see that the doubts are there. As for the Russians, well, some Russians are sounding increasingly confident, and one of them is Abdi Alaudinov, the head of the Chechen Special Forces units, which are operating in this area. In fact, my impression is that if anything, he's sort of even, well, I won't say he's enjoying what is happening, but anyway, he seems to feel that it's playing out very much according to how the Russians would like it to. He says it is worth notice, this is a comment that he's made today. He said it is worth noting that as of today, the situation is under control. Most of the territory where the enemy was located has been protected. Now that suggests that the Russians have reoccupied significant parts of it, but it's not clear what he means exactly. He says mop-up activities are underway to knock out the enemy from all residential areas. All Russian military units in the area are completely engaged in the work and destroy the enemy at a good pace. And that was something he said in a television interview. And then he also told TASS that the Ukrainian army is suffering heavy casualties and enemy troops are being destroyed in large numbers daily. The enemy is indeed sustaining heavy casualties. Russian troops have destroyed 45 pieces of Ukrainian military equipment in just one area in Kursk region over the past 2 days. So that's from Alaudinov, and bear in mind, again, that tallies closely with what my source is saying. Now, let's just quickly cover the situation on the other battlefronts. The Russians are advancing, and Putin said that their advance in Donbass is going to accelerate. And the Russians have now confirmed the capture of Lysychnoi, which is located close, village of Lysychnoi, which is located close to Pokrovsk. And we've now had an article, a comment from a Russian security officer, in other words, someone within the Russian military, who's told TASS the Russian armed forces have brought Lysychnaya under control. This has straightened out the front line, and now Russian troops are advancing towards a major Ukrainian hub in Dmitrov on a broad front. Dmitrov is Mirnograd. It is the eastern suburb of Pokrovsk. It looks from this as if the Russian attack on Pokrovsk itself is about to begin. An event which logically ought to be given far more attention than it currently is, because of course if Pokrovsk were to fall, it would be a far more consequential event than whatever it is that the Ukrainians are trying to do in Kursk. And briefly, we also find that the Russians have been continuing more advances in Toretsk. There doesn't seem to be much doubt any longer that they have broken into Toretsk itself. The Ukrainian troops in Chasiv Yar say that they are under as much pressure as ever, and the 79th Brigade talks about, the Ukrainian 79th Brigade continues to talk about relentless Russian pressure upon them in Konstantinovka, where things, according to the 79th Brigade, don't seem to be going very well. I discussed all of this in detail, in more detail, in my program yesterday. In light of the length of this video already, I'm not going to say more. Anyway, one brief comment which I intend to enlarge on in my next video. The Western powers have issued an incredible statement calling on Iran to back down. I'll discuss it further in my next program. It requires rather more attention than I can give it at the back end of what is already a video, a very long video now. The Iranians, of course, have completely rejected this demand. It seems to me that the battle lines in the Middle East have been drawn, and a battle will at some point over the next couple of days or weeks begin in earnest. And I suspect that when it does, that will push all of the events in Ukraine off even the Western headlines and have an effect, by the way, on the American election, which I'm not going to speculate about. But anyway, that, it seems to me, is where we're going. Well, this is where I stop my video today. More from me soon. We'll see, as I said, if the Ukrainians have any more tricks up their sleeve. There were claims yesterday that they were going to try and achieve more breakthroughs elsewhere along the border. They did launch some attacks, but nowhere. They don't seem to have pushed through anywhere else, and they do now seem to be short of reserves. So anyway, we'll see what they do. But anyway, the key point to take away from the events of the last 24 hours is that Putin has, for the first time, clearly signalled that there are not going to be negotiations with the current government in Kiev, and that regime change in Kiev is now the Russian objective. That is a major change, shift of position on Putin's own part, and of course it will shape the events from this point going forward. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you will find all sorts of amazing things: mats, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. Links for all of these places under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.